I recently asked everyone on a community post which short story they wanted me to cover next, and an overwhelming majority voted for Luca Blight, the Mad Prince of Highland. Luca's backstory was explored in a short story titled Critical Point, which was included in the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 3, a book that released in Japan in December 2001. A warning to everyone in advance: if you liked Luca being an irredeemable, bloodthirsty madman who laughed in the face of death and wanted to watch the world burn, you should probably tune out here, because this short story covered an event in Luca's childhood that turned him into the monster you see during Suikoden 2. It's a tragic event that creates an air of sympathy for him, and that can kind of ruin the image of him for people who like to view him as a merciless monster of pure evil. I just wanted to give you that little warning in advance to avoid potentially ruining your image of his character. This story primarily takes place 17 years before the events of Suikoden 2 in the solar year 443, when Luca was 10 years old. This short story does, however, contain a timeline error, as the story states the peace agreement between Highland and the city-states was signed 15 years ago, which would have put the end of the war between the two nations at the solar year 428. But that's actually the year the war began. The war ended when the peace treaty was signed in the solar year 434, so there is a timeline mistake in this short story. The story begins during the events of Suikoden 2, as Luca is sacrificing the people of Muse to the Beast Rune on Joustin Hill. The hill was stained red with blood, and all that could be heard were the screams of agony and the moans of despair, followed by the cries of death as Luca grabbed the people of Muse by their necks and drove his sword through them one by one as if slaughtering livestock. The blood spurting out of the people he butchered had stained his silver armour, turning it a reddish copper colour. Luca took pleasure in every life he took as he felt the Beast Rune's power grow with every sacrifice. The Highland soldiers watched from a distance, fearing what might await them if they upset him. With no more people left to sacrifice, Luca begins to think back to the last time he stood on Joustin Hill, 17 years ago when he was just 10 years old. Several months after the signing of the ceasefire agreement that brought the 6-year-long war between Highland and the city-states to an end, the Highland royal family were invited to a ceremony in Muse City. Luca was eagerly looking forward to the ceremony as it was his first time leaving Highland territory. Luca travelled in a carriage with his mother Sarah along with 2 servants, while King Ageres rode in a carriage ahead of them. After crossing over the border into Muse, Luca stuck his head out of the carriage window, trying to smell the grass and the wildflowers. Sarah called Luca's name. Luca then pulled his head back inside the carriage and apologised. Sarah smiled and held Luca's hand. The warmth of her hands made Luca's heart race. Seeing his mother's smile filled his heart with joy as he told her how excited he was to be able to spend time with his parents. The royal family soon arrived at Muse City. Their carriages were met by a cheering crowd with waving flags as confetti filled the air. The Highland royal family visiting Muse was viewed as a sign that true peace had finally arrived. Sarah and Luca waved back at the crowd from their carriage windows. The grand reception took them by surprise, as something like this would never happen in Highland, as the more reserved and conservative Highlanders don't hold such grand festivities. Being welcomed in such a manner by so many people embarrassed the young Luca. The carriages soon came to a halt at the foot of Joustin Hill, and from there they would walk the rest of the way. After making their way to the conference room, Sarah and Luca sat at the back table. As Luca watched the leaders of the city-states sit around the table, he began to pity the people of the city-states for not having such a brilliant leader like his own father, as their own leaders were unable to make any decision without a large group debating and coming to an agreement. Just then, King Ageres was announced, and the whole room fell silent as he entered the room. Luca's heart welled with pride. He couldn't believe he was the son of such a wonderful man, and he began to applaud as his father made his way to the conference table. Luca was surprised by how simple and direct everyone spoke. It was a far cry from the fancy formalities of Highland, and Luca wished it was as simple as this at home. Following the ceremony, everyone made their way to the banquet hall. Luca gazed at his parents with pride. His father looked majestic, and every other woman paled in comparison to his mother's beauty. Mayor Daryl approached, asking the young Luca if he was bored. Luca could see the hate in Daryl's eyes and mumbled that he wasn't bored. Daryl then introduced Luca to his daughter Annabelle, who held out her hand. In Highland, it was considered proper etiquette to kiss the back of a woman's hand. Luca stretched back his left leg and held Annabelle's hand, but as he tried to kiss her hand, Annabelle shook his hand forcefully, causing Luca to repeatedly smack himself in his own face. Annabelle tried apologizing, but Luca rejected her apology. Luca's pride had been hurt by the incident, and he repeated the scene in his head countless times. The fact that other people saw him smack himself in the face left him so embarrassed that he wanted to die. The next day, the Highland royal family would begin their journey home. In the carriage ride home, Sarah covered Luca with a blanket to get some rest. Luca couldn't help but think how lucky he was to have such a wonderful mother. Luca then faked being asleep and leaned his head on his mother's shoulder, but the warmth of her body and her comforting smell soon caused Luca to fall into a slumber. A short time later, Luca awoke in a confused panic as the carriage had begun moving in a frenzy. The wheels were shaking and the lamps were clattering and clanging together. Luca asked his mother what was happening, and she explained that their carriage was being attacked by bandits, that they're surrounded and it doesn't look like they can shake them off. Luca was at a loss for words. He couldn't understand why anyone would want to hurt them. Sarah told him that the carriage would soon come to a stop and that he was to run as fast as possible, that she would stay behind to draw their attention. Luca refused, shouting that he wants to stay with his mother. Sarah then slapped Luca across the face and held tightly onto his shoulders, informing Luca that his life doesn't belong to him alone, that he is the Prince of Highland and he holds great responsibility towards the people of his country. Sarah then wrapped Luca in his blanket, kissed him on the forehead, and opened the door of the still-moving carriage. She whispered to Luca that she loves him and then pushed him from the carriage. Luca hid under his blanket as the bandits continued to chase after the royal carriages. Not far from where Luca was hiding, he could hear the screams of men and the cries of women. Hearing his mother's cries, Luca gained the strength to stand up, but his body wouldn't move forward. Luca's body was frozen in fear. The Highland Royal Guard arrived at dawn, where they found Luca bundled up and trembling in fear by the foot of a tree. They placed Luca in a carriage and rode back to Renwy. When they reached the palace, Luca couldn't believe what he saw. His father sitting on the throne with not a single injury or the slightest bit of damage to his clothes, as if he wasn't even present during the attack. Luca asked his father why he was shaking, and recalling his own shock, realized his father was shaking in fear. Luca asked for his mother, but Ageris, who couldn't even look Luca in the eye, told him that his mother was rescued before he was and that she's in shock and resting. Luca then began to shout at his father, asking where he was and why he didn't save them. Ageris replied that he went to call for help and that as King of Highland he couldn't risk being killed. Luca became angrier and angrier, accusing his father of running away like a coward and for not caring about what happened to him and his mother. Luca once again asked about his mother, wanting to see her, but Ageris forbade him from disturbing her and refused to allow Luca to see her until she recovered. Ageris then began thinking back on the attack. The attack on the carriages happened shortly after crossing the border back into Highland, with 10 men attacking each carriage. According to a report he received from the Royal Guard, the bodies of the dead bandits were gone from the scene by the time they arrived, making Ageris believe that these were no ordinary bandits and that they had to be trained soldiers belonging to an army. Ageris ruled out a coup from their own military, as Highland was stable politically after having recently gained new territory in Kiaro. Ageris then began to think back to the banquet in Mews after the ceremony and remembered how Daryl had smirked and smiled suspiciously at him. He also remembered hearing how Daryl was the only one opposed to the ceasefire agreement and that he tried to stop it through nefarious means. Ageres then realised that this attack must have been ordered by Daryl, but as there was no proof, there was nothing he could do about it. If Ageres was to take any countermeasures against the city-states, it would be viewed as Highland breaking the ceasefire treaty. Ageres cursed himself. He figured that the attackers were only after him and that if he escaped, everyone else would be okay. But that was now nothing more than a poor excuse. His wife had suffered severe trauma and his son now hates him due to his cowardice. Ageres declared that he won't let this attack pass. As the attackers numbered over 50, they couldn't easily pass through a border without drawing attention. Ageres ordered the border with Muse and the path through North Swallow Pass to be sealed and planned to have the bandits captured and tortured until they revealed who gave the order for the attack. Luca returned to his room where an elderly woman called Marielle was waiting for him. Marielle was a longtime servant of the Blight family, originally serving as Sarah's nanny. Luca viewed her more as a grandmother and would often confide in her things he was unable to speak to his parents about. Marielle consoled him, but Luca remained speechless. He feared that if he told her about how he ran away from the carriage and how he was unable to save his mother, that Marielle would consider him to be a coward and abandon him. Marielle stroked Luca's head and reassured him that his mother was recovering and that it's okay to cry. Luca couldn't hold it in any longer. He burst into tears as he told Marielle everything that happened. Marielle wiped his tears away and Luca began to ask about his mother. Marielle chose her words very carefully as to not traumatize Luca even further, and revealed that his mother's wounds aren't bad, but that she's still in shock from what happened. She told him that the bandits haven't been caught yet, but that the Royal Guard are looking for them. Luca declared that they were going to get it from him too, and that he'd spit on them. Marielle tried to calm him down and console him, but Luca's heart began to fill with hate. The next morning, a man called John woke Luca up. Luca asked where Marielle was, and John told him that Marielle had fallen ill and that she had returned home to her own village, that he was Luca's new caretaker. Luca refused to believe that Marielle would leave him without a word and began asking everyone in the palace about his mother's condition and Marielle's whereabouts. Not a single person in the palace would reveal any more details than his mother was okay and that Marielle had returned home, before putting their heads down and rushing away from Luca. Some of the servants even avoided him entirely. Even his own father would dismiss him, declaring he was too busy to talk. 10 days later, still having no word of his mother or Marielle, Luca snuck out of his room at night by climbing out of his window. Luca hung from the window frame, his feet touching a protrusion in the wall. Luca shuffled along the wall until he reached an open window. Inside he found a tidied room, as if no one had been there for a while. Without thinking, Luca flipped over the futon and began smelling it. The smell reminded him of his mother. Luca then searched the closet and found that most of her clothes were missing. His mother was gone. Luca then ran out of the room and made his way towards his father's room. Luca flung the door open and demanded that his father tell him where his mother is. Ageres finally explained to Luca what happened. Ageres revealed that of the 24 people who went to Muse, only he, Luca, Sarah and 2 servants survived the attack. Ageres' nonchalant attitude filled Luca with even more anger. Ageres then informed Luca that there were no surviving eyewitnesses, so they don't know how each person was killed, but all of the women were defiled, including his own mother. Luca didn't understand and asked his father what he meant. Ageres' face turned bright red and told Luca that he doesn't need to know. He then informed Luca that his mother suffered a terrible mental trauma and that it would take time for her to recover. Luca began crying and collapsed to the ground, begging to see his mother. Ageres commanded Luca to stand up, telling him that as the heir to the throne, he can't lose his composure over such trivial matters. That he's almost 11 years old and it would do him good to be away from his mother and to focus on his studies. Ageres then gave Luca a hug. It was the first time his father had ever hugged him, but Luca reacted coldly, only wanting to know if the attackers had been caught yet. Ageres tried to set Luca's mind at ease, telling him not to worry, that the royal guard are still searching. Luca angrily responded, "Are you searching for them earnestly?" Ageres' tone immediately changed, shouting at his son to be quiet, that such insolence will not be tolerated. But still, Luca wouldn't drop the matter, and he once again asked where his mother was. Ageres refused to answer and ordered Luca to leave the room immediately. Ageres knew that once Luca got an idea into his head, he'd never let it go, and that if he knew his mother's whereabouts, he'd go running to see her at any cost. Ageres couldn't bear the thought of his son being traumatized further by seeing what became of his mother. Ageres loved Luca, but it was only because he was so busy with his duties as king that he rarely got to spend any time with him, and why Luca was so attached to his mother and Marielle. Ageres recalled how Han Cunningham, Luca's sword instructor, revealed that Luca's swordsmanship was so good that he could easily take on 5 men alone, despite his young age. Ageres worried that if Luca set out on a journey, there'd be no stopping him. Ageres then summoned a servant and ordered that the watch over Luca be tightened. He had John, Luca's new caretaker, relieved of his duties, and ordered that an elderly lady replace him, knowing that Luca has a soft spot for motherly figures. He then ordered that the gag order on speaking about Sarah and Marielle be reinforced, that nobody is to speak to Luca about the matter. 6 months later, Luca was now 11 years old. Luca had recently discovered a new hobby, killing insects. Taking the lives of such small creatures became a source of pleasure for Luca. His targets gradually increased in size as he soon began targeting birds, rabbits, and even dogs. Luca would often fall into a daze while tormenting them, only to regain consciousness and find them in pieces and covered in blood. Luca felt a sense of guilt when he saw the animals in pieces, but he was unable to stop himself as the pleasure he felt when he went into a daze was greater than his guilt. Luca had finally discovered where his mother was staying when his new caretaker accidentally let it slip. Sarah was staying at the royal villa in Kiaro town. Luca began making preparations to sneak out of the palace, tying his pony up in a different spot than usual, readying aged garments, preparing food for the trip, and even growing his hair long. On the day he was ready to depart, he tied a rope to the foot of his bed and threw the rope out of the window. He then climbed down the castle walls. Luca then hid in the shrubbery, crawling towards his pony. He then pulled the dagger from his waist, cutting his own hair and his pony's mane before covering himself and his pony in dirt. His disguise now complete, he made his way towards the palace gates with his head held down. The guards standing watch mistook him as a servant and let him pass. Travelling along the empty road, Luca was attacked by several wild monsters. He considered eating their corpses to preserve his own food, but considered it to be beneath him. The day after arriving at Tenzan Pass, Luca's supplies had all but run out. He heard a man calling out to him, offering him 2 pears. Luca ate one and fed the other to his pony. The man then requested payment of 500 poch for the 2 pears. Luca understood the concept of poch, but he never had to pay for anything before, and he told the man that he had no money on him. The man then grabbed Luca by the chest and started shaking him violently. Luca then fell to the ground and the man kicked him in the stomach before taking his pony and riding off. The pony was a gift from his parents for his 7th birthday, and losing that pony made him feel worthless. The thought of killing the man who stole his pony crossed Luca's mind, a thought which confused him as he never thought of killing a person before. Luca continued making his way along the path, and the next day he spotted some aster flowers along the side of the road. Aster flowers were his mother's favourite, so he picked some to give her as a gift. After picking the flowers, he then continued down the path and reached Kiaro village later that night. Arriving at the villa, Luca announced himself to the guards, who laughed at him and brushed him off. There's no way this dirty-looking peasant could be the prince. Luca maintained his composure and snuck into the villa using a secret passage that led into the villa's garden. Luca spotted his mother in the main wing of the villa. He couldn't help but notice how thin her arms and legs had gotten, how short her hair was, and how big her stomach had grown. Luca ran towards his mother, calling out her name, but the moment he touched her hand, she screamed and started pulling out her own hair. Luca didn't understand what was happening. He tried to calm his mother down by telling her it was him and that he brought her favorite flowers. Sarah pushed the bouquet away and continued pulling her hair. She tugged on her hair so hard that her head started to bleed. Luca tried hugging his mother to comfort her, but she swayed back and forth without acknowledging him. A woman then called out to Sarah, asking what was wrong. It was Marielle. Luca was speechless. Marielle looked much older than he remembered. Her hair had now turned pure white, and her previously plump body had become thin. Marielle asked Luca what he was doing here. Luca wanted to hug her like old times, but her voice remained stern. Asking him why he had come and if his father knew he was here, Luca told her he wanted to see his mother and that he came here by himself. Marielle insisted that there's nothing to worry about and that his mother will soon recover. Luca asked what's wrong with her, and Marielle replied that she suffered a terrible shock during the attack. Luca confusingly asks when she was defiled, not knowing what it meant. Marielle replied that's right, and ever since that day she has nothing but hatred for the people who attacked the carriages and wants to kill them all. Those words stuck in Luca's head. A murderous intent then began to appear in Luca's mind, and Luca replied that's right, they're better off dead. Marielle then promises Luca that she won't tell anyone that he was here, but that he must return to the palace to his father. As Marielle walked Sarah into another room, Luca felt a wave of loneliness. He was no longer the most important person to the two dearest people to him. He used to believe he was lonely because he couldn't see them, but now he felt even lonelier. Luca cried as he walked down the streets of Kiaro, and the fact that those who saw his tears didn't even seem to care made him even more depressed. Luca eventually found an abandoned house in the outskirts of town. He planned to spend the night there, but heard some voices coming from inside. He was about to turn around and leave, but heard the men inside saying Agares and Highland. Luca went around the side of the house, and to his surprise, he spotted his pony tied to a pear tree. Luca felt a flame light up in his chest, as if he discovered a way to unleash his pent-up emotions. Luca then heard another voice coming from inside the house. He pressed his ear up against the wall and heard the man from before talking about Daryl, the mayor of Mews. Luca continued eavesdropping on their conversations, hearing them making fun of his father for being a coward and mocking him for not even sending out troops to hunt them down. One of the men lamented that they couldn't return home, but the leader of the group tried to change the subject by reminding them of the fun they had with the Queen. The men started laughing, talking about how rumour has it that the Queen is staying in town and how lonely she must be, and that maybe they should pay her a visit. The men then cheered in agreement. Luca couldn't take it anymore. He finally understood what his father meant about what happened to his mother. Luca could feel his blood boiling with anger and his body trembling with rage. The blood vessels in his eyes burst, causing him to only see red as he felt a flame light up in his chest. Luca screamed he was going to kill them all as he burst through the door with all his might. All of the men stood up, but when they realized it was just a child, they all sat back down. The man who stole Luca's pony recognized him, tauntingly asking him if he had come to get his pony back. Luca ignored him and walked straight up to the person sitting nearest to him and drove his dagger into the man's neck, twisting the blade until blood started gushing out. The man then died choking on his blood as the blood spurting out of his neck painted the walls and the ceiling red. Luca then grabbed the man's sword and charged the remaining men. Luca couldn't believe how weak they were or how easily they fell, nor was he aware of his own skill with a sword. The only person he had ever crossed swords with was Han Cunningham during their training sessions. Seeing their dead blood-soaked bodies all around him filled Luca with a sense of excitement and pleasure. The thought of the lives of others depending on his mood made him feel powerful. Luca then realized he no longer had anything to be afraid of. Luca then snapped out of his daze, covered in blood and sitting on the floor. The one surviving man was the man who stole his pony. The teary-eyed man was begging for his life, dragging himself along the floor trying to escape. Luca thought he looked pathetic, desperately clinging to life. Luca then drove his sword through the man's chest. Luca thought that Marielle would be happy to see their heads and wanted to bring them to her, but instead he chose to return to the castle as she instructed him. On his way home, Luca realized he had forgotten his pony. He wanted to laugh, but all he could muster were tears. Luca couldn't understand his emotions. He didn't understand why he was crying when he felt he had nothing left to fear. Luca then began to think. He now understood two things: that he would never allow this burning flame in his heart to extinguish, and that he was now a killer and that he liked it. Luca then spotted the patch of aster flowers that he had picked from the day before. Luca drew his blood-soaked dagger and began slicing the flowers before stomping them with his feet. He then stood in the middle of the flowers and screamed at the top of his lungs. He then heard someone call out Prince Luca. Luca turned around to see a terrified soldier kneeling before him. Luca was standing atop Joustin Hill, surrounded by the bodies of the people of Muse. The soldier informed Luca that they received a message from Gordeau, the leader of the Matilda Knights. Gordeau had been in secret communication with Highland for some time now, and Luca was enjoying manipulating him. Luca then fluttered his cape and ascended Joustin Hill. And that's it for Luca Blight's backstory. As I mentioned at the beginning, this backstory came from a short story titled Critical Point from the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 3, a book that released in Japan in December 2001, 3 years after the game released. If you like these lore videos covering book material that only released in Japan, let me know in the comments and I'll make more of them. You can find a list of the remaining character short stories in the pinned comment. Let me know which ones you'd like to see next. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.